Welcome to California Frontier, the show about the often overlooked and unexpected early history of the place we call California. I'm your host, Damian Basich. Today I'm going to read a short article about the Bear Flag Revolt. Bear Flag Revolt was the pivotal moment in Alta California's history in which the Mexican-American War really touched that territory and became the catalyst for Alta California becoming the American state of U.S. California. This is an article that I wrote for the California Frontier Project website. So if you'd like to read the text, you can find it at www.californiafrontier.net/Bear Flag Revolt. In the 1840s, even before the gold rush, increasing numbers of U.S. immigrants began to arrive in Alta California. Spurred on by books and newspaper articles touting the mild climate, fertile soil, and open land of the Pacific coast, individuals and families began to find their way across the Sierra Nevada mountains and into Mexican-controlled territory. Unlike earlier Anglo-Americans who settled in Alta California, who had arrived mostly by ship, these newcomers were not willing to adopt a Hispanic lifestyle and to assimilate. Hostility between the U.S. and Mexico was increasing due to the dispute over Texas. Most Americans expected that California would become part of the U.S., just as Texas had, and considered it only a matter of time for that to happen. In the meantime, political tensions among Mexican Californians were high. California-born leaders had recently wrested control from governors imposed by Mexico, but were suspicious of each other. Northern factions based in Monterrey, who called themselves Arribeños, and led by the military commander Jose Castro, were organizing against Governor Pio Pico, whose headquarters were in Los Angeles, and who was backed by the ones who called themselves the Abajeños, the Southerners. In the midst of this situation, U.S. Army Captain John C. Fremont arrived in Alta California with a detachment of 60 heavily armed men. And this was in January of 1846. And after having spent some time at John Augustus Sutter's fort on the Sacramento River, also known as New Helvetia, Fremont traveled to Monterrey. There, he met with the U.S. consul and confidential agent Thomas O. Larkin, a New Englander who had settled in Alta California in the 1830s. He and Larkin discussed the hostilities over Texas and U.S. plans for Alta California. While in Monterrey, Fremont informed Commander Castro that his purpose was to map a route west to the Pacific by way of the Oregon Territory. He then requested permission to pass the winter in California before making the journey. The Mexican authorities granted him leave to travel through the San Joaquin Valley, where there were only a very few Mexican settlements. In March of 1846, however, Jose Castro discovered that Fremont and his men were in the Salinas Valley and not the San Joaquin Valley as promised. The commander sent orders that they were to leave immediately and proceed directly to the Oregon Territory. But rather than follow Castro's directives, Fremont and his men set up an encampment at nearby Gavilan Peak, now known as Fremont Peak, raising the U.S. flag in the middle of Mexican territory for all to see. A standoff ensued, and Fremont remained in the area for a few more days before moving north to Oregon. 2 months passed without incident. But on May 13th of 1846, the United States Congress passed a declaration of war against Mexico. After hearing the news, it didn't take long for Fremont to return to California. By May 24th, when the captain and his men arrived in the upper Sacramento Valley, stories were circulating among Americans that Jose Castro wanted to attack and expel all Anglo settlers. Rumors only increased in early June, when Commander Castro, who had set up headquarters at Santa Clara, traveled to Sonoma to obtain horses from General Mariano Vallejo. Castro's plan was to organize a force to defend against the American invasion of northern Alta California. He also hoped to use the horses against his rival, Governor Pio Pico, whom he expected to march north to consolidate his control over the territory. Vallejo provided Castro with some 170 horses, some from private individuals and others belonging to the Indians in Mission San Francisco Solano. Castro returned directly to his headquarters in Santa Clara and left a detachment to escort the horses back. On June 9th, a group set off from Fremont's camp to pursue Castro's men. They surprised the Californians the next day at the rancho of Martin Murphy, an Irish immigrant. Led by a man known as Ezekiel Stuttering Zeke Merritt, they took the horses Vallejo had provided, but let Castro's men keep their own mounts. On June 9th, a group set off from Fremont's camp to pursue Castro's men. They surprised the Californians the next day at the rancho of Martin Murphy, an Irish immigrant. Led by a man known as Ezekiel Stuttering Zeke Merritt, they took the horses Vallejo had provided, but let Castro's men keep their own mounts. The Californians rode back to Santa Clara to alert Castro to what had happened. In the meantime, Stuttering Zeke and his men brought the horses back to Captain Fremont's camp, further south on the American River. Encouraged by their easy victory, their next step was to head towards Sonoma and the headquarters of General Vallejo, the most powerful man north of the San Francisco Bay. The party arrived at Vallejo's home in the early morning of June 14th. Although Mariano Vallejo was an experienced military man, the army barracks at Sonoma had not been used in years, and the pueblo was peaceful. The diplomatic Vallejo welcomed some of the raiders in and courteously offered them drinks. The general then assured them that he was not an enemy and was even open to an American takeover. The conversation went on until those standing outside became impatient and demanded Vallejo's arrest. After electing a man named William B. Ide, a carpenter from Massachusetts, as their leader, the Americans arrested Vallejo, his brother Salvador, and Victor Proudhon, Vallejo's secretary. After electing William B. Ide, a carpenter from Massachusetts, as their leader, the Americans arrested Vallejo, his brother Salvador, and a man named Victor Proudhon, who was Vallejo's secretary, and headed towards Sutter's Fort. Along the way, they stopped at Fremont's camp to receive instructions. There, Vallejo asked Fremont why they had been arrested. The captain claimed that he was not involved, but nevertheless ordered Vallejo and the others imprisoned. The men would remain as captives at New Helvetia until August of that year. On June 15th, Ide, who had remained in Sonoma with other insurgents, issued a proclamation to the citizens of Sonoma. It claimed that the Mexican government had been oppressive, tyrannical, and despotic with the immigrants, and called on all people to join them in establishing a new and just government. He promised that peaceful Californians would not be disturbed and had nothing to fear. Ide's men had taken down the Mexican flag in the main plaza of the Pueblo and replaced it with a new, quickly handmade flag. It bore a star and a bear and the words California Republic emblazoned on it. Because of the flag, and perhaps because of their rough appearance, Ide and his group would come to be known as the Osos, or Bears in Spanish. On June 17th, José Castro received word that Vallejo and the others were imprisoned in New Helvetia. He soon sent an irate message to John B. Montgomery, captain of the USS Portsmouth, asking for an explanation of Fremont's behavior. The Portsmouth was a troop ship that had traveled up from Monterey to the San Francisco Bay to prepare for hostilities, and Montgomery had received a similar message from General Vallejo himself. The general had informed him of his captivity and asked about Fremont's involvement in the Bear Flag affair. The captain's reply echoed Fremont's. Both he and the army officer were neutral and unaware of the Osos' plans. In his role as commander of California's military, Castro issued exhortations to the Mexican population to be ready to sacrifice themselves, quote, for the defense of liberty, the religion of our fathers, and our independence, unquote. His next step was to begin raising a force to try and attack the Osos. In order to do this, he had to reach out to his rival Pico in the south. Castro proposed that they set aside their differences in order to fight the common enemy. On June 23rd, after several days of silence, Pio Pico issued a proclamation. He urged all Mexican citizens to pursue, quote, the treacherous foe and punish his audacity, unquote. Pico warned them that if the U.S. took over, it would impose, quote, the horrible slavery permitted in its states, unquote. He then called on Mexicans to imitate the example of the Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae and fight to the death. Pico then reached out to U.S. Consul Larkin, asking for an explanation of Fremont's and the Osos' behavior. Like Montgomery and Fremont, Larkin also replied that he had no control over their behavior and protested the neutrality of the U.S. On June 19th, a group of Californios captured two of the Osos, whom Ide had sent to obtain gunpowder near Santa Rosa. The Californios executed the two men, and rumors soon spread among The Californios executed the two men, and rumors soon spread among Americans that the killing had been unwarranted and brutal. A few days later, on June 23rd, a brief battle between Californios and Osos took place near Rancho Olompali, owned by Camilo Enitia, a Miwok Indian friend of Vallejo's. There were one or two deaths on both sides, but each group eventually headed in opposite directions. The Osos back to Sonoma, and the Californios to San Rafael, further south. On the same day, Captain Fremont, having heard that José Castro was preparing a force to assault the Osos, set off with 130 men, including U.S. regular troops, Delaware Indian scouts, and American civilians who had joined him. He had now shed any pretense of neutrality and was confident that the U.S. Navy would back any actions he took. The group arrived in Sonoma on the 25th, and the next day marched towards San Rafael, where they expected to battle José Castro's troops. When they arrived in San Rafael on the edge of the San Francisco Bay, Castro and his men were nowhere to be found. 3 days passed with no action. On June 28th, however, Fremont's men noticed a small boat coming across the bay toward them. As the boat landed, 3 men got out. Francisco and Ramon de Haro, 2 sons of the former alcalde of San Francisco, and José de los Reyes Berriesa, the 61-year-old owner of Rancho San Vicente, south of San Jose, whose son was the alcalde of Sonoma. The boat and its owner then turned around and headed back across the bay. As the three Californians began to walk up the shore, Fremont's men, led by the famous frontiersman Kit Carson, shot them. Carson later alleged that Fremont told him that he had, quote, no room for prisoners, unquote. On July 1, Fremont and his men convinced Captain William D. Phelps of the American bark Moscow to ferry them across to an old fort known as the Castillo de San Joaquin at what is today Fort Point in San Francisco, beneath the Golden Gate Bridge. Of course, the Golden Gate Bridge didn't exist at that time. The Spanish had built the bulwark in the 1790s, but it had been abandoned for some time. Fremont ordered the cannons made inoperable by spiking them. For Fremont, the gesture was a symbol of his willingness to aggressively pursue battle. On July 4th, the triumphant Fremont and his men returned to Sonoma, where the Osos and their followers organized a victory celebration. The following day, Fremont made a public declaration of his willingness to lead the fight against his enemy, Jose Castro, without officially offering to conquer California. He then got ready to head back to Sutter's Fort for the next phase of hostilities and to plan further action. When Fremont reached New Helvetia on July 10th, he received some surprising news. Actually, unsurprising news. A messenger from Sonoma informed him that Commodore John Drake Sloat, commander of the U.S. Navy's Pacific Squadron, had raised the U.S. flag over Monterey on July 7th. Captain Montgomery raised the U.S. flag over Yerba Buena, San Francisco, on July 9th. By the end of July, Fremont and his men officially became the U.S. Army's California Battalion and went on to fight, this time officially, in the battle for California. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code PODCAST, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code PODCAST, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.